we are recording this event and you can actually have this available. You can actually get a copy of it or rewatch it in about 30 days, in about a month. If you are on our YouTube or part of our Facebook member group, you will get that video there too. I don't see anybody else waiting in the lobby, so I think we can get started. Scott, again, Scott is our presenter. He is a wonderful speaker. He has a ton of experience, I believe 40 plus years of experience in project management, strategic operation development, lean management. He's currently the managing director for Group Atlantic, a consulting firm that advises private, commercial, and governmental organizations in successful strategy development and operations improvement since 1992. He is also an adjunct instructor at Loyola University, where he teaches executive education courses based on his nearly 40 years of experience in software systems and management. Scott, I will let you jump into the presentation and just take it from there.
Well, thank you, Florence. And thank you for everyone that's sharing some time over a lunch hour. I'm hopeful that if you haven't already grabbed something to eat for lunch, I know your days are very busy, that you'll feel very comfortable in taking lunch as we go through this. This is going to be interactive as you care to. So we're going to be asking you from time to time to enter into the chat stream some responses. I think that's one of the better benefits of sessions like this, is where we're learning from each other and contributing to a community shared understanding of very important field of discipline. Today, we're going to talk about risk management. So let's kick it off with this kind of challenging phrase that my associate at the Cutter Consortium says. He says, risk management is project management for adults. I'm wondering, enter in the chat stream, I'm wondering what you might be thinking that Tim Lister has in mind, perhaps based on your experience. Why does he say risk management is project management for adults? Go ahead and enter something into the chat stream right now, the first thing that comes to mind. Hopefully you can type as well as enjoy your lunch. Anyone have some thoughts? So Mary says, think about consequences. Definitely, yes. Thank you, Mary. Bobby says, we had a lot of experiences based on good and bad. That says, take some thought and dedication to address risk. Need to have some maturity to deal with risk. I love what Kathy says. It's not for the faint of heart. Perhaps Kathy's had some direct experience with risk management. I'm hopeful. Favorable experiences. Serious business, right? It's not for children. It's for mature professionals, people with experience. Kathy reminds us it's about being effective. Well, that's the spirit. Thank you for everyone jumping in. I know sometimes it's difficult to take lunch while you're typing in the chat. We're going to do this from time to time to let each of you check in. You can do that at any time, by the way. And Florence is going to keep an eye on the Q&A. So if you need to raise your hand to get her attention, I am absolutely comfortable with having people interrupt me, particularly for questions of clarification. Let's go ahead and take a look at this next slide. A vivid representation of a pilot in the cockpit of, in this case, an experimental aircraft that's never been flown by another human being before. And if you notice the garb of this test pilot, she is wearing a crash helmet and a fire suit. And she's examining some paperwork. The engine hasn't been started yet. I'm wondering what thoughts are going through this test pilot's mind. Very experienced test pilot. What kind of questions are going through her mind before she starts the engines and takes off the aircraft's very first flight ever by any human being? What kind of questions? Why am I here? Thanks, David. Any other thoughts? Because risk management is about asking good questions and getting good answers. Right, being prepared. She's looking at a checklist. I am a private pilot, single engine land ratings and glider ratings. So a lot about what I learned about project management preceded my role in project management decades ago, because I learned how to fly airplanes. And checklists are important about questions that we want to ask. When do we want to ask them? It's before we actually go aloft, where the risk exposure is greater than before we've actually started the engines. Lori says she's also recalling, perhaps informed by the checklist, also from her memory of what she's learned, both good and bad, about how to successfully avert risk this time so that it doesn't spoil her whole afternoon, right? So the first thing that she's going to be thinking about generally, these are very broad questions, is about what can go wrong. So risk management is about, in business, we have objectives. What can go wrong with the achievement of that objectives? And then how will I know it's going to go wrong? In the pilot's case, she's going to be saying, well, I'm looking out the cockpit window, and for a while, the sky was above me and the ground was below me, and I checked my checklist and I looked up again, and wouldn't you know it, the ground is above me and the sky is below me. And I didn't ask the airplane to do that. So how will I know it's going wrong? What will it look like? Or what will the instrumentation look like? How will I know something's going wrong based on the instrumentation? And there's a lot of that going on, in addition to what pilots are famous for with so-called seat of the pants flying. The other question is, when will I know it's going wrong? And the key to that question is, will I find out that it's about to go wrong soon enough so that I can take an aversion action to mitigate the risk, to avert the risk successfully and in time? Because the action I take to avert the risk has a latency for effect, right? I have to expend resources, reorganize my team, change direction, whatever we have to do. Will that have enough time between between the time I'm alerted to the risk, the time that the risk aversion action takes effect? So timing is very important. And then, of course, what do I do about it? What are the protocols? What are the procedures that in medicine, in firefighting, in aviation are very crisp? We train on these things. We learn about them broadly and inform each and every pilot on the planet about what can we do before it goes wrong. And once it does go wrong, if it's already going wrong, what do I do at that point? So some of them are more proactive and some are more reactive. So here's my general question to you. You don't have to put this in the chat stream, but I'm wondering now if you're thinking that, if I just ask these questions and got better, useful answers to these questions on my projects, not just at the beginning of the project, but throughout the project, I, as the project manager, and my teams and my stakeholders would be better off. But most people answer yes. We take a look at the next slide. Some of you may recognize this, even if you're not from the Chicagoland area. Some of you may fly through, I'll just kind of reveal it. This is close to Midway Airport, and a number of years ago, an airliner on a very snowy day, like I think we're headed for another snowstorm, aren't we? In the Midwest sometime in the next day or so. They skidded right to the end of the runway, went through the termination of the runway and into the intersection, just in civilian land, right? Well, just as pilots never intend to experience this, where they're nose down, the nose gear clearly has collapsed, and they're in the street with their aircraft. They didn't intend for that to happen. They do everything they can in advance of the flight, in advance of actually their approach to the airport, as they're about to land on the airport, even as the wheels have begun to touch down. They're making decisions informed by their understanding of weather and the maintenance records and all kinds of other factors, including the culture of our pilot community for this particular airline, and how we train and what kind of protocols we follow. We use those things in advance, even on landing and approach, even as the wheels are rolling. Do I do a go around? Because that's another option, and not so much of an option at Midway Airport, in Chicago because it's a relatively short runway compared to, others like LAX or O'Hare Airport. And so project managers need to do the same sort of thing. We need to be very deliberate and intentional as adults, thinking about our business environment. How is it changing? What's our situational awareness? How is our management of the technology changing? What's the maturity of our project management capability? What's our organizational culture around decision-making? What we're going to find is that decision-making is at the center of project management, and particularly the risk management discipline of project management. It's all about the future of our present decisions that we're making. Each time we're about to make a decision, and we make decisions all day long, don't we? Individually, with others, what's the future of that decision we're about to make? And what could go wrong with it? One of our objectives, how will we fall short of that? So the idea behind risk management, whether it's in aviation or project management, is to narrow down our view, get a focus on where can we have an effect. Okay, because if there's no effect, why bother? And it's where we are, if we do have taken action for effect, where will it be more beneficial, right? So we're looking for return on investment, we're looking for leverage, we're looking for the best decisions that remain in the short amount of time that we might have available to us to make the decision where it will still have an effect. And we want to do that before it turns into a crisis, if at all possible, before it actually we realize it into a problem. Because we should understand that risks haven't happened as a problem yet, right? It's only the potentiality of something going wrong, right? It's a probability. By the way, it's not just a good idea. It's not just because it's in the PMBOK. It's because the government has actually decided on our behalf, if you're a taxpayer, at least for a taxpayer in the United States, that if there's a government, specifically Defense Department contracts, the Clinger-Cohen Act says, you got to be doing risk management. You got to be doing risk management the way I'm going to describe it. And we're going to find them, hopefully, as you're listening to the workshop here, and you can ask questions about this. We're going to cover fundamentals, because if any of the fundamentals are absent, we're not going to be successful in our project. Fundamentals of risk management, that is. And I'm hopeful that I'm going to be able to enumerate for you several differentiators that most organizations do not do, and they make the difference between success and failure. So it's not just a good idea, it's the law if you're working in a federal kind of contract situation. It's kind of a pop quiz. Here's a question for you. So we said we need, just like a pilot, we need to have information about maturity of our projects, the maturity of our project management capability, the technological environment, the culture of the organization, and so on and so forth. Who's got better data like that, risk data? The average high school football team in Texas, or the average project team? Let's say we'll pick the top 100 project teams in the state of Illinois, right? We're the Central Illinois chapter. Which of these two? Go ahead and put in the chat stream. Just say Texas or project team. First answer is Texas, 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 Texas. The football team. Everybody's saying the football team. Now, the good thing is I'm hopeful we don't have any interlopers here. And there's nobody from the outside saying, oh my gosh, these are project management professionals that are spending their lunch hour in a professional organization setting in a webinar. And there to the person, to each and every one of you that's chosen to respond so far, you're saying a high school football team has better data than we do, perhaps, whether we're at State Farm or CNA Insurance or whatever, we're a professional project management team. That's kind of scary, isn't it? That's and you know what? It's true. It's the sad truth. And in fact, this has been researched. So if you pay dues to the Project Management Institute, I think most of you do, the Dr. Bill Ibbs did some research and took all the knowledge areas and looked at successful projects and unsuccessful projects, and found of all the knowledge areas, the most closely correlated to successful projects, those were projects that were doing risk management. And he also found, incidentally, that of all the knowledge areas, risk management was the least practiced of all the PMBOK knowledge area, if you think of those as disciplines, which pretty much agrees with our quick straw poll, right? You know this. This is not new, although you may not have been familiar with Dr. Bill Ibb's research. So the big difference maker on any given project is going to be your proficiency, your capability at identifying and managing risks, certainly better than your competition can. There's a strategic layer to this as well. So your attention over a lunch hour is worthwhile, whether it's me or anybody else, because it's the difference maker for projects. We're going to give you a case study that's going to give you some pretty respectable numbers. So if you haven't read the High Risk Society, boil it down to three things. To be successful with risk management, you have to have the right psychological attitude. Think about it as culture. It's how the leadership team makes decisions and treats its employees with regard to risk. It's the way employees feel about their comfort level for elevating risk to the attention of superordinates, to peers, even to customers. That we need to have the sufficient financial resources to proactively deal with risk. And there's no such thing as a safe world out there. So even at the best risk management companies, and we're going to tell you about one today, we're going to suffer risks eventually as problems, hopefully smaller problems than they would be if we didn't do something proactively to avert the risk. We're going to need to have the financial resources to survive that. And it's enough smarts about risk management to manage the risks intelligently. So the story, I spent almost 2 decades with a company that many of you may be familiar with, Rockwell International. It was a conglomerate. It's actually a Fortune 28 company when I was with Rockwell. I was at a local Illinois-based Rockwell business. One of my sister businesses was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Rockwell Collins, one of the best managed companies on the planet. So we're going to tell you about their practice of risk management and how it was a difference maker in terms of business results. Okay. So let's take a brief historic look. In the 1950s, in the United States, airliners were crashing often. In fact, over a 6-year period, there had been 65 mid-air collisions, as you can imagine. The tragedies of the mid-air collisions, there's a pretty low survivability rate when something like this happens, right? One or the other of both aircraft and its passengers are going to suffer greatly. And so this is even before there was a Federal Aviation Administration. What happened was that the airlines that were in competition with one another and yet shared the experience of mid-air collisions banded their resources together and said, if we pool our resources, let's find a company that can help us with this risk, that we're realizing the risk of collision and it's becoming realized as a problem because it becomes a mid-air. So they sought out what they collectively agreed was the best company on the planet, was Rockwell Collins. It was led by, pictured in the lower right-hand corner, is Arthur Collins, who originally founded Collins Radio in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. They had some of the best engineers on the planet, and collectively the airlines placed an order for 900 systems for collision avoidance. Nothing like this existed. They imagined it, they hoped it to be existed. They had a vision that something like this could be brought to realization by someone like Arthur Collins and leadership of one of the best engineering companies in the world. So Collins Radio won the contract. And of course, after it was 10 million, and by the way, 10 million then was over 100 million in today's US dollars. The engineers worked on it and they worked on it. And there were opportunity costs because they stopped working on other things. Engineers finally had to inform Arthur Collins that the technology just doesn't exist and isn't going to exist anytime soon to solve this problem. So now the question is, what do you do? What's the next decision for Arthur Collins to make? What risk is he exposed to if he makes the wrong decision, that it will become realized? Well, I'll tell you, Arthur Collins realized that if he kept working on it and still didn't produce a solution for the airlines, it was his reputation. Here's what he did. He returned all $10 million. Now he had sunk costs, right? He had to pay the engineers, he had to pay for the buildings and the heat and everything, equipment, test equipment, material. So he had sunk costs, and yet he returned all 10 million and absorbed the loss entirely on his own. And to this day, although he's long deceased, people in the hallways or in the cyberspace on Zoom and Microsoft Team meetings, they still ask the question, with this decision, what would Arthur Collins do? Because there's an ethos at what's now Collins Aerospace. It's no longer a Rockwell company. There's an ethos that informs how they made their decisions. Now, let's advance this about risk management practice. This became a mature practice, project management for adults, as Tim Lister would say, in the year 2001. And in September of that year, on the 11th of September, there was a profound tragedy. There was an attack on the Twin Towers and on the Pentagon, and an airliner that crashed in Pennsylvania. And as that related beyond the human tragedy for Rockwell Collins at that time, again, this is 2001, within days after September 11th, remember, Collins Avionics produced all the front office electronics, avionics for all the world's airlines. It was a huge part of their business. And aviation business grounded to a halt. All aircraft were grounded, period. Okay, it wasn't just fewer airplanes, no airplanes were flying. And if you were there at the time, you can recall it took a while before any airliners were flying again. And so what happened? Airlines stopped placing orders, they canceled orders with Rockwell Collins. And so greater than 15% of Collins' projected revenues were vanished in 2 weeks. Think about what would happen with your business if within the next 2 weeks, 2 weeks from now, more than 15% of your business just went away. Okay, and at that time, Collins had just spun off from Rockwell and was trying to stand up on its own as an independent company. So it was fragile like a newborn. And other avionics companies were completely whipsawed by this event. What was the outcome at a mature risk management company? Their capability allowed them not only to survive, but to position themselves for steady growth in the decades to come. And they continue to grow. For them, they were a mature project management company, as well as particularly around risk management. We brought in an outside auditor to take a look at at Rockwell Collins, those projects out of scores and scores of projects that did risk management, as I'm going to describe it to you today, against those other projects there where project managers said, well, it's a great idea. It's a wonderful idea. I'm all for it. Just on this project, you don't want to set us back on our schedule and a budget, blah, 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 and all those excuses. So they said, well, it's opt-in. It's opt-in to do it as, for example, I'm going to describe it today. And the final results of the audit were those organizations that were doing risk management, as we're going to describe it, enjoyed, if you're familiar with earned value calculations, cost performance deltas and schedule performance deltas, double-digit improvements on cost and schedule performance with less variance between the original estimates and the actual achieved. Okay, so the conclusion was that the programs that were practicing risk management diligently had the best cost and schedule performance. And since then, Forbes magazine has named them Best Managed Aerospace Company of the Year twice. And years running, they've been named the most ethical company. And why is that? It's because every time a decision is made, they think about the future of that decision. And the way they think about it is through a risk management discipline. And think about the difference in perspective from that ethos of a company or culture of a company from, let's say, oh, let's go ahead and say Enron, okay? So that discipline was there and it was sustained. Each and every employee was trained on it. And it was to ask the right questions. And that's how we began our webinar today. What are the right questions to ask in order to provide decision makers with answers that are relevant to their objectives and that are timely, so that when they get answers to their questions about risk, they're soon enough to where there are precious few opportunities to take action. It's before a crisis develops and it's effective, right? So it's about minimizing surprises in the bottom line. I've never met a senior executive, and I've been doing this for several decades now, that enjoyed negative events, bad things happening, and being surprised by it. It's like the worst thing. And it's career limiting. Let's just say that. So what, just in the chat stream, what kind of questions are you asked in your role as in relation to projects and project management? What kind of questions about risks do you get asked? And particularly the critical few risks that you feel that you are really challenged to give good, solid answers to. That maybe the asker of the question is not always as pleased as you would hope them to be with your answers. So we'll just take a minute and go ahead and put in the chat stream, what kind of questions are you being asked about your projects regarding risks? Any thoughts there? There we go. Thank you, Harry. What is the probability of a detonation of this experiment, and what are the consequences? Yes, life and limb safety kind of issues, right? The team's data integrity, duplicate checks that we get a lot. Can we deliver the service in all these countries? Most just get asked about how quickly we can implement. Thank you. What existing great mitigations are in place? That's what what are we already doing? I love those questions, Lori. And I'm wondering, Lori, are you confident in the way you're able to answer those questions? And Bobby says, how soon can we implement this patch, right? And what's the consequence of being late with the implementation? What's the consequence of not doing it at all? What if the patch doesn't work? What if the patch makes it worse? Good. Eric says, what will happen if the funding is reduced? Good. That's a frequent, often threat where people are taken away, budgets are taken away, equipment is taken away, various reasons are taken away. Some questions are easier to answer than others. So let's take a look at a checklist of questions. How about that? So thank you for responding. I really appreciate that. Very good. And by the way, there's a way of capturing, if you're not familiar, there's a way of capturing the chat stream after we're done today, where you can get a .txt file, and you'll be able to then review after the fact any of the entries from not only your own, but people that are on the call with us today. So here are the key questions. Here are the best practice. We need to be very capable, like adults. What are today's risks? But not just a risk register, but are today's risks higher or lower than they were before? Are we trending towards disaster, or is it becoming less and less of a risk, and therefore no longer worthy of the attention, as much attention as we thought going forward? Okay. Are the risks likely to get higher or lower in the future? So we're thinking about, and where are we going with this? Because we're always trying to figure out which are the critical few risks that are worthy of our further attention and worthy of then deciding whether action is to be taken and whether that action is going to be successful. So as someone said, what's being done to reduce the risk, to monitor them, to prevent them in the future? All right, let's not just wait around for them to happen. Let's be proactive and do some problem prevention. Who's my go-to person for the aversion measure? Who do I call? Right? How do I know if the aversion measure is being put into place, and is it successful? or is it no longer successful? What's the timetable for the aversion measures? How soon do I need to put the aversion measure in place before it's just too late? The latency for the aversion measure to take effect is going to start taking effect after the problem has fully been realized. So why do anything at all? That's where you're on a collision course, right? The problem is going to happen. It's just a matter of when. And so now the way you approach your choice of actions is different than wasting your time on something that you think might be proactive, when in fact, you really are in a reactive mode. It's a choice, and that choice needs to be informed by an understanding of the temporal nature of this. And the other key question is, how and what should I communicate internally, even with my closest buddy at work, to other teams at work, to my suppliers, to my customers? So if you think back about the Klinger-Cohen Act, the assertion there is that defense contractors better share risks as soon as you identify a risk with the defense contractor, the Air Force or the Army or the Navy, whoever is paying, because the taxpayers are paying for this stuff. And we need to work together with collaborative risk management, okay? And so the answers to these questions are our checklist approach, a little bit more specific than when we were talking about the test pilot, right? So I'm hopeful that the takeaway of this checklist of questions is something that you can use to augment your current risk management practice. And for some of you, it's your very first checklist to ever use. The idea here is that we systematically and iteratively keep asking these questions, because the situational change, we need to maintain, just like pilots and firefighters and surgeons, an acute, precise situational awareness. Okay, so there are standards for risk management, international standards. My longtime associate, Dr. Robert N. Charette, chaired the IEEE and ISO risk standards. You can go out there and you have to pay to, not to me, but to the standards bodies. They get copies of the risk standards, and there are multiple risk standards. But at the center, this is going to be a stylized representation, something useful to discuss the basics. In the middle of the whole thing, the starting point, go no further. Don't go down the yellow brick road until you've considered three things. What exactly are our business objectives and how are they measured? And how are the senior stakeholders measuring them? Okay. So if it's in net new revenue, we need to go from 20 million to 37 million, a delta of 17 million. Okay. That's the target. Or we're going to increase our market share, or whatever it happens to be. We start with the objectives, then what assumptions are we making about how we're going to about achieving those objectives, and what are the natural constraints, not the self-imposed constraints, but the natural constraints, market constraints perhaps, or constraint that Rockwell Collins had is this technology doesn't exist. There's no technology for this. We're constrained to the point where we cannot deliver a solution. And the first thing to think about also is the self-imposed constraints. Like, it's got to be done by September 1st. Really? Who says? If we're done by September 10th, what's going to be the business consequence? If we're going to be done on January 10th the following year, what's the business consequence? So the idea is a lot of risks are we take them on ourselves when we accept artificially self-imposed constraints. So based on an understanding, a clarity about objectives, assumptions, constraints, objectives, assumptions, and constraints, now we say, how do we identify for any given objective what can go wrong with our achieving that objective? To what extent might a decision we make or an event occur that we will fall to some degree short, an unacceptable degree short of our net new revenue target or our utilization targets or whatever it might be? And then we do an analysis, which essentially is, let's keep cutting it down to the critical few that are worthy of our attention and will give us payback. And then we'll come up with a plan. What are you going to do about it for the critical few risks that are worthy of our attention in action? And then once we take the action, we're going to track to see how it works out. And then we're going to take controlling action, because if what we're doing doesn't work out, we're going to have to go to plan B and plan C, because the plan A aversion action isn't working out the way we thought it would. And then the actions we take to avert the risk often, in most cases, beget new risks, right? So if I choose a different path, that other alternate path is not risk-free, it has other risks. So there's an iterative kind of recursive that can go on ad infinitum, but we kind of bound it based on the context. So if it's looking at when a detonation will occur, we're talking about life and limb, we're talking about safety. The boundary there is a different kind of boundary than, well, you know, we're $1 billion company and we'd like to add 10,000 in new revenue. You know, somebody's on the line for 10,000 in new revenue at $1 billion company, but really, it's not even on the radar at the senior executives. It's just kind of like a rounding error. And now when we work with companies like the Google and Apple, you know, a few billion here, a few billion there, pretty soon you're talking about real money. So to make this practicable, there needs to be a contextual boundary. So let's just kind of recap here. The first mistake most organizations make is they don't zero in on clarity around the objectives, because the articulation of risks, and you'll see this in a frame or two, is specifically referencing specific measured objectives. And the other is that all risk management maturity is not appropriate for all situations, okay? And we have to, if there's a far difference where there's life and limb as opposed to where there's a very recoverable kind of blip in our revenue. And it's entirely tolerable by the shareholders, the stakeholders, and that sort of thing. So quick representation, principles developed by Dr. Robert N. Schredt, one of my longtime associates. I want to start giving you some examples of what this will look like. So this is not the final result, but this is some from real work where from the London Ambulance case study, London Ambulance Service case study, some real work we did in the United Kingdom where they were automating the dispatch of ambulances in London. Some of the early thinking, we start to capture them around, well, what are the objectives? We've got some examples of the objectives on that project and the assumptions and the constraints. Early on, just placeholders. And we start to refine our understanding as early as possible. We start to assign measures, whether they're in monetary measures like pounds or schedule measures like months. And we continue to refine those and start to narrow the confidence interval with the estimates or the way we measure those. And it's entirely then determined by the confidence interval that's tolerable by the stakeholders. That's how one of the early deliverables of that process might look. And to go after the risks, we think about 4 categories. So think of this as kind of a graphical checklist. What are the political risks, the dynamics between stakeholders? You know, is it a zero-sum game? Do we have the prisoner's dilemma going on? Are there politics in terms of external politics, governmental politics, the dynamics between other companies in our ecosystem, value ecosystem? And what are the organizational risks, operational risks, the technical risks, as well as the economic risks? So the idea here is sometimes as project managers, we're going to ask the technical people for help. What could go wrong with this objective technically? In the case of Rockwell Collins, they said, well, the technology doesn't exist. And nobody here, we think, is going to be able to come up with it for another 5 years if we identified everybody in the company to work on it. And they're asking us for a deliverable by the end of the year. So it's, you can't get there from here kind of thing. All right, so there are technical risks. There's, we have to, this operational, there's a whole different way for us to do it. So we talk to the line people, the field people, our satellite locations. This is going to change the way we do things, right? So with the organizational change management aspects and so forth. And now there's a different set of people that a project manager will generally consult. Generally, you don't have those type of people in the same room with the technical people. And the same thing, you probably aren't going to have those types of people in the same room with the finance people that are taking a look at, it's not looking so good. about your project funding. I know we were going to fund this project with this much, but if we go through another 2 bad quarters, we're probably going to cut your budget by this much, right? Unfortunately, they usually don't tell you that all that much in advance. So it's about decision-making, which objectives will be affected, how far short of which objectives, based on the way senior stakeholders measure those objectives, are going to be placed at risk by a decision that someone is making or by an event that occurs. And the way we frame this is, say, for any given context, it's going to be a different context if it's about threat of detonation compared to losing 10,000 in a billion, multi-billion dollar company, right? But based on the context, we use our checklist of political, operational, technical, and economic. Those are our sources of risk that then we say, based on our identification of those sources, a decision is coming up where there's a political risk that will cause this consequence to this specific objective. And so generally, we're going to start with objectives, think about our decision. Okay, we're going to be making a decision. How is that going to affect our objective? Let's haul out our 4-point checklist and get these 4 different perspectives. So if we're in a technical organization, usually we're constrained, self-imposed constraint, just looking at the technical aspects. What I learned as a project manager was that I need to consider sources of wisdom and insight across all 4 of these in order to better identify what the consequence of that objective is. Okay, so what's now usually missing is people, I speak to audiences, hundreds of people in the audience. I take a raise of hands. How many of you doing risk management? I'm getting more and more raised hands. And then I ask the next question. Then everybody wants to show me the risk register. And it's like kissing babies, a politician kissing babies. Oh, what a beautiful baby. Yes, you have a beautiful risk register. Just have another question for you. Raise the hands. Who can tell me a story right here and now? Who can tell me a story about a risk identified that we took an aversion action that actually led to lesser of a negative consequence to one of our objectives? And I've spoken in front of thousands of people and all I hear is crickets, because I'm usually not speaking at Rockwell International at Collins Radio, right? So the idea here is when I work with my clients is that once CTO that sponsored my work with his entire organization on something like this, he said, oh my gosh, Scott, we basically did a after action report briefing him on the new capability his organization had. And I showed this slide. And he says, oh my gosh, all my staff meetings have to structure our articulation of risks this way. When people say, Scott, how do I get the executives to pay attention to me? Because I bring risks to their attention and they don't seem to be of any help. Well, what you need to do is say, boss, your objective, your bread and butter is connected to this decision. And we're going to fall this degree short of how you measure that because of this political, this economic, this technical risk. That gets their attention real quick. And then what we need to do is say, well, what do you want me to do? And if you don't have some suggestion of what they need to do to help you, once again, they feel helpless. So our job is to inform them. And some examples of sources. Here's examples of technological sources of risk that include possible root causes. So root cause is something that we haven't talked about yet, the likelihood and consequence, and then the timing. Because how soon, if this is one of the risks that we're going to actually have to choose to take action on, we might have to actually give our attention to these, because if we wait any longer, our opportunity to avert the risk has come and gone. The train has left the station. So just kind of an example excerpt. And then here, where the objectives are enumerated, and we want to then continue to mature these with measures. These are incomplete without measures, that all the stakeholders, as they view this objective, can agree on what the measures are and how we measure them and how often we need to measure them. And so we're saying, well, for this measure, for this objective, guys, these are the different things that can go wrong with it. And this is just an early beginning identification of risk drivers, because they don't have the articulation of this, do they? So we have to have this full articulation for each and every one of these, but this is early on. This is an early stage deliverable for the process. So here's a pop quiz. Just put into the chat stream. Read the statement to yourself and tell me whether you choose true, false, maybe, or I'm not sure. I'm rooting for somebody to say I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe is the closest right answer, I think. So, by the way, this is not PMP exam prep time. This is the real world. So let me pick up the pace just a little bit since we only have a few more minutes here. Think about what happened with the Challenger disaster. And this is from the after action report, which, by the way, my associate, Dr. Robert Encheret, was on the review team. How is it that the decision-making risk management capability led to loss of vehicle and loss of all souls on board? So with the Challenger disaster, it was very important to try to understand that they deemed the launch to be an acceptable flight risk, that upon exposure to freezing air temperatures, the O-rings of the solid rocket, molten thiol solid rocket boosters would become inelastic and on stresses of launch would fail, causing loss of vehicle and loss of all souls on board. So we need to have another element added to our risk practice, and that's perspective. From whose perspective is this a risk? So for some people at NASA, it was okay to launch those astronauts. And for the engineer that was studying the consequences of the freezing temperatures on the O-rings of the molten thiol solid rocket booster, it was unacceptable risk. And so the basis here is that situation A here and situation B are perceived entirely differently if we're an established Fortune 50 company or if we're Elon Musk on day 5 after PayPal, and he puts a lot of stuff at risk. It depends on perspective. So assuming only one perspective is a frequent, broadly held mistake of most organizations. We have to understand the risk from different personas and different perspectives, which makes it very challenging. And what we need is not a risk matrix. Matrix are for children. What we need is a risk referent, which is the difference between the gray area and the not gray area. So as to differentiate clearly, risk number 1 is unacceptable. Risk number 3 is clearly acceptable. And notice how this doesn't not lend itself very readily to those little matrix boxes that are very cute, but useless and misleading for decision making. With the wisdom of an actuary, we have to assign the curve of this risk referent, the shape that we see here, just like an insurance company. I mean, State Farm, I bet you, is one of the people, it must be from State Farm people in this audience. That's the way the actuaries decide how you rate the insured. And the toughest risks are the ones that are like risk category risk 2, because on the borderline, and we're trying to run quicker and quicker, and we forget about risk 2 because we don't have time. And yet risk 2 has a confidence interval that's higher and below and to the left and the right. So there's a lot of the area of risk 2 that could easily be unacceptable. And those are the usually ones that bite us and the ones that move along. So most of us understand that risk is defined as the product of probability and likelihood. And what we find is there's false precision. So in the molten thiol example, what's the difference between a 0.69 probability and a 0.71 probability? Well, one is moderate and one is high. And the smart Alex in the audience might say, oh, it's 0.02, Scott. Well, in the case of the Challenger disaster, one person said it's a high risk, and the other person said it's a moderate risk, and these astronauts are paid to take moderate risks. But it's not a moderate risk. It's a couple hairs breadth on the high side. So let's take a closer look at it because of the consequence. So this thing about what's acceptable and unacceptable risk requires skepticism and a critical thinking look at false precision. Okay. Risk with just putting them in registers is might as well not do it at all because it just uses up effort without action. And so what we need to do is for each and every risk we identify is say for that risk is an informational risk or a control risk or a time risk, and then keep track of which historic risk aversion actions were very effective. And here we see that risk aversion actions H, D, and C were particularly effective for informational risks, whereas if it's a time risk, plan E, A, and G are your go-to plans. So Rockwell Collins would begin to archive success stories so that if now the newbie project manager came along and say, yeah, I've got a control risk right here, I'm going to go look up the success stories that others have had. I see that with a control risk, I use plan B, plan I, and plan F, just the way Sully Sullenberger did things when he lost 2 engines. And he and Jeff Skyle understood that this is a situation that calls for these protocols. We trained for it, and project managers need to train for it as well. And that's the way they did it at Rockwell Collins. And train to take a choice of actions. I think most of you know that there are 4 discrete choices, although most of us simply choose to accept risks. That tends to be the de facto. And if we don't understand when to pull the chute, the actions that are in the plan are useless. So here's, and it has to happen sometimes in a matter of seconds. So Sully Sullenberger was taking off for an East Coast destination, lost both engines. First plan B was to return to LaGuardia, rate of descent, loss of airspeed, said plan B is out of the question. He's being informed that Teterboro is 6 nautical miles to his port side. He thinks, I've been to Teterboro, I like that airport, I'm going to try to make Teterboro. Loss of altitude and energy and airspeed. When are you going to pull the chute? He finally decided, and he said, didn't ask for permission, we're going to be in the Hudson. So you need to know what's the trigger where you're no longer going back to LaGuardia, back to Teterboro. You're saying, I'm going to be in the Hudson. That was the first and only water landing. So it's about tracking, process control, following the steps, having protocols for making timely, well-informed decisions, for proactively pulling for risk information, actively seeking it out as a project manager, being proactive about attacking the root causes, addressing systemic risks, and treating decision-making as a skill. So as you're thinking about questions to ask, I'd like you to consider connecting with me. One way you connect with me is send me an email. We can connect via LinkedIn. I love to connect with you via LinkedIn. If you've got a mobile device, you can put the camera on the QR code and it'll give you, LinkedIn information and all kinds of contact, my phone number and so on and so forth. And one way or another, however you get my contact information, I'd like to offer this little card that we used at Rockwell. It's a simple card. It's kind of old school. It's actually a laminated card. And this is what the card looks like. It's the front and the back. And if you send me an address to which to send this card, name and address, I will send you a card. And it'll be for your very own. This is actually a reproduction of the actual card that was used at the case study that I described to you. So I'm hopeful that you'll ask for that card and you'll start to use this. What questions do we have? As we have a few moments to wrap up.
Yes, we have about 4 minutes and I don't see anything in the chat. So I think we're good. Are we good, everybody? No questions? If not, I can just do a quick announcement, especially because I had a few people. Okay, Bobby has a question. Go ahead, Bobby.
But I think you've talked to a lot of leaders as well. What's the common theme, if you can mention, if there's a common thread that you can show of leaders' responses to COVID-19?
Oh.
Because I think that's the biggest black swan for a lot of people globally, that is, for that matter.
Yeah. So COVID was not a black swan. I know Bobby saw, people might be shocked that I'm being argumentative with him. It wasn't a black swan, and I'll tell you why. For over a decade, my associate, Dr. Robert N. Schredt, was writing about pandemics and how to prepare for a pandemic. As you know, we had bird flu and all kinds of other potentially life-threatening pandemics over the last decade or two. So really not a black swan. The fact that it was going to be a coronavirus, difference, yep. But means of propagation, we knew a lot about how those things had happened, and yet people chose not to attend to that sort of thing. So the common thing in terms of your question really, Bobby, is a reaction, is they were bewildered as to what to do because they were not prepared. And they felt threatened because it wasn't in their safe zone of decision-making. Most companies did not have a mature risk management capability, so they did not have a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D ready to go the way Sully Sullenberger, you know, from power out, from engines out to splashdown in the Hudson, it was a matter of seconds. So they had to go systematically, taking in situational awareness and things. So the other thing that most senior executives, a theme, is they didn't have situational awareness. What's going on? I don't know what people, the common theme, to be blunt about it, is how do I know they're working? I don't see them in the office anymore. And my response is, well, come on, how'd you know they were working before? And what do you actually need to know? Situational awareness, COVID or not, whether you're on-site, remote, or hybrid, or anything in between, if there is something in between, who knows? So they felt in the dark about information because they weren't ready the way a pilot in an aircraft is. If this instrumentation goes down, I'm going to have a backup and a backup to the backup. And that's why the space shuttle, by the way, which was a product of the company I worked for, Rockwell International, was the most complex machinery on the planet because of the redundancies and the safety measures. There's a fellow, Harry Elston. Harry must have experience. You were the one that talked about detonation, so I'm very curious about, Harry, what some of your background is. And we learned, so best risk management practice does come from those life and death situations. Okay, thanks, Ellen. Bye-bye. Any other questions?
That was it. We were just getting a couple people signing off. That's it. So before we lose any more people, I just want to say thank you, Scott, for a wonderful presentation. You gave us a lot. And I'll be one of those people who reach out to you for the card, because I think it should be something that I have on hand. As far as the chapter, please visit our events page to register for future events and just to keep up in general. Well, we hope to see you guys on the 23rd. We are having a Black History Month special dinner with this very special gentleman, Michael Laidler. Please support us, and we hope to see you there. If there are no other questions, I don't think we have any questions. Definitely, Pat, this was very good. Yeah, so we can just stop here. It's 1 o'clock, 1:01, and I can't thank you enough, Scott. Bobby, I can't thank you enough for all your help in getting Scott and connecting me with Scott. And thank you. Have a good one.
And Florence, just before we let go, I wanted to capture the chat stream.
Yes.
If I can do that, right?
Yeah, you should be able.
Some people are leaving contact information in the chat stream. Everyone.
I know I was prompted to save the chat, and I did select save chat. So I should be able to find it if you don't have
Yeah,
your-
if you have it, please do send it
Yeah,
to me.
I was prompted to save it and I did select to save it.
Very good. Thank you. Well, it was my pleasure, Florence. Thank you for
Same
putting all
here.
your professional diligence in putting this together. I'm
Thank
so pleased
you.
that this was my first chance to speak with the PMI CIC, and I'm hopeful I will have a chance to do it again sometime.
We shall. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.